We, the members of the
secret
secret order of
alchemical
alchemical actors, do solemnly commit ourselves to a full and honest telling of the history of the occult as far as we know it.
Sounds great every time.
That might have been the most stressful reading I've ever heard.
We're used to it, but it is a little bit like a mental exercise.
Whew. Did it.
We are here again. My name is Rob C. Thompson, the Supreme Hierophant of your alchemical actors, with Luke Kinnaman, our Producia Discordia, and a couple of friends familiar to our listeners if they enjoyed our Houdini episode. Luke, who are we talking to today?
We're talking to the ever magnanimous Judas and Magnolia. Wonderful pair returning back, husband and wife couple there. From daring escapes to seance and traveling the world performing their arts. Hello.
Hey, thank you for having us.
That's us.
Thank you for joining us.
You know, I find that people get my name wrong quite a bit. And sometimes in the Midwest or maybe even the South, I think it's because people just don't want to call me
They
Judas.
just don't want to do it.
So they'll stumble. They'll say Julius,
Julius a lot.
Judah.
Oh,
They won't say
Judah.
Judas until I correct them and make them do it.
Judas, but it's pronounced Lucifer.
Yes.
You know, none of you guys have got to see our show, but maybe some of your listeners have if you're in the Ren Fair world. Whenever we're doing our underwater escape, you know, I come out, my name's Judas, I'm wearing a tights with a giant codpiece and a tiny vest. I'm just like the guy that like the Midwesterner is like, oh God, where do I look and what do I do with this information?
I mean, I've seen the pictures, and it is impressive. If
Yes,
I was a Midwesterner, you'd have me, my heart racing.
Historically accurate and all natural. You're welcome.
There you go.
Yeah, his favorite thing is if by the end of the show, if he can get the crowd to on their own chant Judas, Judas, Judas,
You know,
right?
it's because it tells me that we've won them over, because you're not going to do that as a regular American in favor of somebody. Chant the name Judas. So I've taken them on this ride. You know, I've taken them on we're really off topic here, but I've taken them on what I see as like a social credit ride. Right? Like I've stepped on stage. My name is Judas. I have on tights and a codpiece. I've started out very low in like the social capital store with like this Midwest man who has a ball cap on and is dressed in camo. But by the end of the show, if I can take him on this ride where I've earned his trust enough that when I go underwater, he spontaneously starts chanting the name Judas. Yeah. Like I've earned like this social capital that will pay off afterwards, hopefully, and then buying merchandise.
Yeah. Story.
That's how you got to do it. Your next merch item needs to be a picture of the Last Supper. It's just everyone excluding Jesus is chanting Judas.
You know, it leads to my favorite joke. I only get to tell this joke once a year. Only once a year, one festival day a year.
It's coming up.
Easter. Usually most festivals do a 3-day weekend. Easter. Generally when I'm standing in the water tank before I'm pressed underwater and I've got to do a life-threatening stunt, I look at the audience and I let them know, for all of you folks out there who are celebrating a 3-day weekend, speaking on behalf of all people named Judas, you're welcome. Half the audience laughs and half doesn't, and I get pushed underwater.
Oh.
The Buddhists don't get the joke. I think that's the problem.
Some people are left out.
Some people don't.
My other favorite joke, and this happens every now and then, there's a trend at Renaissance festivals where some people will come dressed as Jesus. So if one of them ever ends up in my audience, usually midway through the show, I'll stop and I'll sort of reintroduce myself for all the people who came here a little bit late. I'll let them know, you know, my name's Judas, I'm an escape artist. And then I'll walk off stage, usually bound in chains at that point, and walk up to the man who's dressed as Jesus and, you know, mute my mic for a moment, say, hey, stand up, stand up, stand up. Once the guy stands up, I say nothing else. I just lean in and kiss him on the cheek and then turn around and walk back to the stage. Half the audience laughs, half of them just
does not
done
know.
confused at it.
Honestly, half the best jokes are the ones that are just for you anyway.
Yeah, we have fun.
Well, yo, what are we doing here today?
Yeah, what do we want to talk about?
Well, we want to talk to you. There's been some communication between us about your the two of yours theater experience and time on the stage, and kind of recognizing it as a magical kind of sacred space, and just kind of exploring that, especially given Rob's profession as well, and just looking at the connection that kind of exists there.
Okay. Yeah.
Love that.
So we've got sort of an outline on this end, and I tell you, this is going to be a sprint. So we're going to cover a good bit of history here. Just to kind of get where we want to get, we're going to start back at what is like the 5th century BCE. We're going to start talking about Dionysus and sort of at the height of Dionysian theater. I'm sure this doesn't need an introduction for a lot of the listeners here, but Dionysus is a complex character. He's a complex god. There's a lot of contradictions that are going on here. Most people think of Dionysus as like this god of like the vine and drink and stuff. And yeah, that's true. But like he was also a god of madness, and not just like a madness like a little anxiety, but perhaps that, but also a madness of rendering people apart. Often when he would appear, people would be ripped limb from limb. He was a god of like vicious pain and madness. I think it was Nietzsche, but I could be wrong, talked about a good example of him, of Dionysus being like the god of birthing pains, of like this contradiction is really wrapped up in that, of like the pain that it takes to bear this child in the world, but at the same time, this joy at the other end. Then there's some kind of, that can only happen with this weird mix of contradictions that come together, and that is a good way to understand what Dionysus is. Well, but somehow Dionysus then becomes the god of theater, right? But in a time when theater is... It's not like we think about it now. 5th century BC in Greece, theater was a mix of ritual. We had masks, and we had the choir, and we had chanting. It was hard to distinguish where like ritual began and theater began, because in the mind, they were the same thing. And that brings us for a long time. And why is he the god of madness there? I always think about it because we have fans, or I can also think about it in the theme of like a sports team, maybe a football team. Have you ever seen a football team when their team wins, the madness that's induced? Mm-hmm. Cities are destroyed. That's Dionysian madness. It's the rendering apart of something out of this weird mix of joy and pain and celebration. We see the same thing in theater. And I think a person who really touched on that well was going to be like a century later. But before we get there, I think Magnolia had something to add.
Yeah. So kind of hearkening back to these Greek divinities, I wanted to touch real quick on a term that is very dear to us, and it's the word temenos. And so we first learned about this through one of our entertainment directors, Gary Izzo, in his book, The Art of Play. But temenos is a Greek word that means a sacred space or a piece of land set apart for a god or ruler. It can also refer to a temple that has been consecrated for a sacred purpose. So in Gary Izzo's The Art of Play, he says, all play takes place within a playground, a space marked off beforehand, either physically or mentally, deliberately, or as a matter of course. And the ancient Greeks' word for such a space is the temenos. And so a lot of our colleagues cast at, various Ren fairs around the country, actually, this is part of their training, this idea of the temenos, the sacred theater space that we create for ourselves and for our audience, and kind of thinking about, like how we see that with fans. It's really fascinating to me to see that sometimes consciously, sometimes subconsciously, people are coming into these spaces as kind of a form of worship, and I say that as, people on stage, you've got people chanting your name, but it's also, very really, it's these people who are looking for community. There is a certain amount of ritual to these spaces, definitely a sense of performance, right? But we really explore some really beautiful themes, and we see time and time again how this art that we create touches people in these very deep, meaningful ways. And so for us as artists, I think it's so important that we keep in mind that what we are doing is sacred when we come into these spaces. So I think you wanted to move on. Did you want to talk about Aristotle?
Yeah. So kind of so we've traveled forward in time there to like New York with Gary Izzo and the art of play, but let's jump
Modern
back
day.
now to like
Yeah.
what is this? This is going to be like 4th century BCE. This is going to be with Aristotle.
I like our timeline.
Yeah, we're going to
Yeah,
hop
but-
around a bit. We're going to hop around real
Time
hard.
travelers.
Kind of back to 4th century BC with Plato, Aristotle, and those folks. Theater kind of there was one child at the beginning, but when it was like kind of Solomon carried through and cleaved it in half, and now we have like two. We've got like these twins where we have ritual and theater at this point. We've traveled 100 years past the height of Dionysian theater, where they were conjoined, and now they're two separate things, or at least they were conceived of as two separate things at the time. You had distinct ritual and cult, and then you had theater that still had a religious purpose, but they weren't exactly the same thing anymore. But Aristotle sort of put his finger on it. It was 100 years later, and he's the first person I know to really talk about it, but he put his finger on what was happening in theater then and what was happening in the Dionysian theater 100 years before, when he talks about catharsis and the power of theater to let us feel things deeply. We've all had it. Like we've maybe had it when we're sitting in front of a television screen, watching a movie or anything else, and it moves you to tears, or it moves you to laughter, or sometimes we'll watch something on a screen and will just move us to rage. We get to move feelings that are within us, kind of a blockage, and we'll get there a little bit later with what I think that blockage is and why it's important to the divine whenever we talk about Jung and kind of go through his process of alchemy. But this is planting the seeds right now of Aristotle's putting his finger on catharsis, on that deeply moving emotion that happens in theater. Safe space, I think, is the important thing there, is that we can experience laughter and joy in the world, but if you break down crying at your grocery store, people are going to come up to you and they're going to say something. If you burst out laughing or if you burst into rage, you could be escorted out. But it's acceptable to have those cathartic moments in theater. It's acceptable to sit in your seat and cry. You're probably not going to get escorted out. It makes a safe place for catharsis.
It's you're in the company of those of others that understand and can kind of empathize with you because they're seeking that same catharsis.
Well, and the actor is leading the experience, right? I mean, part of Dionysus's role in the theater, the madness, the wine, is the stripping down of self to the core, which is what the actor does at their best, is to strip us down to this most raw moment of loss, pain, whatever, often loss and pain, right, in Greek tragedy. But yeah, so the audience cathartically is having a mirror experience of what the character's going through.
Yeah, the mirror experience. I think that's important, is they get to be there vicariously, and safety. But what was that, Magnolia? I think you had something, right?
I know you wanted to touch briefly on the philosophy of Georges Bataille, French philosopher.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where this is going with me, is I really like Georges Bataille. And I think about him a lot. I don't know if y'all have ever done an episode on Bataille.
We did. His Gilles de Rais scholarship, we contributed to that episode.
Oh, gosh. I really love his concept of the divine and how it's faced, because I think we get to see it in theater, especially through that cathartic moment. He talked about, what was it? I think his book, I'm going to probably get the title wrong, The Inward Journey or Inward Exploration, is when he talks about facing the divine is not something we do in the regular, because I think he might have said sacred as opposed to divine, because a sacred space has to, by definition, be set apart from a regular space, right? The sacred experience, by definition, has to be different from the regular experience. And we've probably felt that, at least I know I have, whenever I've been at, say, a church. I've gone to a church and I've sat in the pew and I've listened to a person speak and we've sung some hymns and I've walked out of the building and I've thought, did I have a sacred experience? Did I have a divine experience? No, I had a really mundane experience. And that opposed to whenever I'm sitting in a theater space and I'm brought to tears. I'm brought to I have a cathartic moment. I experience something in myself that pushes to an extreme. And that's when, according to Bataille, I get to experience what the divine is. It's in that cathartic moment that we get to approach the divine. It's in that motion. It's in that moment that's the extremities of what the human can feel that we get to approach the divine, as opposed to, say, being in the shopping the shopping complex, or sometimes even just being at a church or going through whatever our regular rituals are. We have to be pushed to the edges, and I feel like that's where Bataille is important, and where Bataille kind of connects with Aristotle to talk about the catharsis, and where it connects to theater. So those three things kind of triangulate. We're going to move on to Artaud for a little bit then. We're going to think about like it's a French player, a French thinker. What is that? Theater of Cruelty. I think was the name of the movement. Right. Theater of Cruelty of Artaud. And what you're doing there is it was an artistic movement that avant-garde for the time, and it moved to press theater into the extremes. Ritual, extremely graphic. Wording, violence on stage. You wanted to make the audience uncomfortable and push them to their boundaries. But that connects right back to Bataille because he's there in France at the time. So when we're connecting Bataille and Theater of Cruelty, we can see theater expounding upon his philosophy of experiencing the divine through kind of the edge of what humans can like handle, what the edge of humans can take. So there, as you're sitting in the Theater of Cruelty, you're watching a dismemberment on stage, a violent violent sex act of some sort, that puts you in a place and in a mind that's not the normal, and it's the sacred, but sort of in the sacred of a way that we wouldn't experience in maybe like our Methodist church next door. It's the sacred in a space that's pushing you to the extremes of what the human can feel, and shaking up those feelings in you and giving you the option for a cathartic moment. And that brings us full circle back to like the rendering of a human that you're going to get with like Dionysus and this madness on the stage. It brings us full circle, but like 2,000 years later.
Yeah, Artaud's favorite play was "'Tis Pity She's a Whore," which is about a brother and sister who have an incestuous relationship, and then he carves out her heart and kills both her and their unborn incest baby. Famously, Artaud wasn't able to ever realize his theories, but they were very inspirational. A lot of experimental artists after Artaud, I think, came closer maybe than Artaud ever did in his lifetime to actually figuring out how to do this, because he really didn't want there to be a text. He wanted the play to just sort of exist somehow. And yet he loved plays, so he was always torn.
That whole idea of madness, that's going to bring us a little bit into what we think about how this connects to maybe the occult and maybe some more of this audience. Libra O, I think that's where the quote comes from. I could be wrong. I think it's Libra O, when Aleister Crowley says, "Invoke often and inflame yourself with prayer." I think about that. Libra O. I think about that whenever we're on stage and we're in that mad passion. I don't know if you've ever seen an actor step on stage and, how to put this, they don't breathe. They don't have that moment of actualization. The audience can read it when it's flat. And it's just not convincing art. And not convincing art is not going to give the audience a cathartic moment. It's not going to inflame the passions and have a moment to experience the divine. It's dead on stage, and not dead in a rendering way, just dead in a flat way. But then I think about Crowley, inflame yourself with prayer. And oftentimes, whenever you get into that space to present yourself on stage, you breathe life into the character. There's no other there's no other description I can come up with than that character, that actor has inflamed themselves with prayer, inflamed themselves with the character, sort of invoked into themselves whatever character they need to portray on the stage in order for it to be alive.
So hearing you talk about like taking on that flame, especially when someone's stepping onto stage. So first of all, it reminds me of ways that people have described you when they like know you in like off stage first, right? And then like friends of mine when they've seen you perform. I've literally had one of my dearest mentors say, he stepped on stage and it was like he was a different person, right? And so like it's so fun to kind of like watch your arc as an artist, right? And then to hear how excited you get talking about like Dionysus and like the art of passion and being on fire with the divine and all of that. So that's number one. So that's like really fun for me. And then secondly, so this dovetails with Aleister Crowley specifically. So this kind of imagery of like fire and being on flame. The first time I kind of heard or read about Crowley's descriptions using this kind of imagery, it actually reminded me a lot of Hildegard von Bingen. So for those of you who may not be familiar with Hildegard, 12th century Benedictine abbess, polymath in her own right. She's considered by many to be Germany's first doctor. She was a theologian. She's a doctor of the church. Of which only four of those doctors are women, and Hildegard is one of those. She practiced medicine, wrote multiple medical texts. She was a conlanger. She created her own language for just her and her nuns to speak. I could go on and on about, yeah, I know. I could, if y'all ever want to do just an episode about Hildegard, you let me know. But she was a composer in her writings and her music, and even the illuminations that we still have of hers today, which are, so she was a visionary, right? And these visions that she received were actually ordained by the Pope at the time as being divinely inspired. He sent scribes to go transcribe her visions. Those transcriptions are today called illuminations. So in her writings, her music, her illuminations, she's using a lot of a similar kind of language of being on fire, being inflamed. And for her, that was also divine, right? It was the fire of the Holy Spirit. And so some examples of her work, she writes, in the year 1141, a fiery light, flashing intensely, came from the open vault of heaven and poured through my whole brain. Like a flame that is hot without burning, it kindled all my heart and all my breast, just as the sun warms anything on which its rays fall. And suddenly, I could understand what such books as the Psalter, the Gospels, and the other Catholic volumes, both of the Old and New Testament, actually set forth. So that's just a little snippet of her writing. She has a lot of music, but one of her songs in particular that really features this imagery is O Ignus Spiritus. So the English translation is something kind of like, O Spirit of fire, the life of all creatures, you are holy by giving life to forms. You are holy by anointing the dangerously broken. You are holy by wiping stinking wounds. O breath of health, O fire of charity, O sweet taste in the breasts, and the infusion of the hearts in the good fragrance of the virtues. And she goes on in praise. And then the last thing, those illuminations, if you want to see what I'm talking about, just do an online search for Hildegard von Bingen, and you can see tons of this kind of flaming imagery.
Yeah, so I feel like that's the exact same thing. We can see it on stage with actors. We can tell when they're alive, when they're set on, when they've invoked some spirit, when they're set aflame. Who was it? I think it was John Wesley has that quote, set yourself on fire and people will come from miles around to watch you burn. Yeah.
And then the one other thing that kind of thinking about Crowley led me to was so a tangent on the Golden Dawn. So our theater nerds and then our Golden Dawn history buffs will probably know this name, Annie Horniman. So I want to talk a little bit about the history of merging occult magic with theater. So Annie Horniman lived from 1860 to 1937. She was an early member of the Golden Dawn, and she founded repertory theater as we know it today. She was the founder and funder of multiple theaters, and it was her theater specifically in Manchester that pioneered the repertory theater model. And so what I mean by that is before Annie Horniman, who was a huge patron of the arts, theater companies would perform a play And they would tour it around to different theaters in different cities, right? And so they would have their circuit for the year. Annie Horniman kind of turned that on its head. So she said, come to my theater in Manchester, but I want you to stay the whole season. And I want you to put together a repertoire of, a handful of plays and perform that selection, that repertoire throughout the season. So instead of, a theater company doing one play in many different cities, she turned that around and said, I want you to perform at my one theater, but do many different plays, right? And so Annie Horniman pioneered that. And so she forever changed the face of theater as we know it today. But where the magic comes into this is that she was pretty big in the Golden Dawn. She wasn't technically a founder, but she was like right there in the beginning because she was very good friends with Moyna Mathers, who was married to MacGregor Mathers, who was one of those founders, right? So she was there pretty early on, and she was always consulting her tarot deck, and she actually would use magical glyphs, I love this, in her theater logos. And then she would put explanations in the programs for the audience to read about what those glyphs meant and why they were significant. She was always consulting her tarot about her work, and she would also choose her plays very, very deliberately. So everything that went on stage had a meaning and everything had a purpose. So, okay, that's my last thought about magic in theater. Do we have time to talk about
Yeah, sure. So I think what I was going at, this little tour around Europe and religion and philosophy, starting with Dionysus and sort of wrapping ourselves all the way around to theater of cruelty and kind of back to Dionysus' rendering of people there, is why is this important? What's going on? Why is this sacred? Because that's why we're talking about this. Is why is this sacred? So I think what I get here at the heart is we're going to think about Carl Jung for a second. And I'm going to think about Carl Jung's alchemy of the psyche. What's going on there? Because I think about the stage as a kind of this machine for alchemy. I think about festivals that I work at as these machines for alchemy. And I think that they can create better people. Theater can create better people if it's experienced, right? If this machine is tuned right, it can do these things. So I want to connect all this together with Jung's alchemy. Jung's alchemy has 4 parts, right? It's going to have, the blackening, yellowing, whitening, and reddening, I believe. That's the order. So as a person who's viewing theater, good theater, the blackening, it's whenever, I think right now it's kind of a popular to say kind of the shadow self, kind of facing the shadow self, shadow work. Yeah. And we can see the blackening whenever we see villains on stage, good villains that we can see ourselves in, villains that we can see their point. We can see the feeling of the villain. They're relatable. We can work through shadow work in a layer of watching theater and relating to these people and seeing our own errors in these people and seeing their relatability and seeing that they're a mirror of ourselves, right? But we don't get there easy. We can't get there through flat theater. We've got to get there through theater that is inflamed, theater that brings catharsis and inner work. Next, whenever we're going to work with Jung, we're going to go into the yellowing. And the yellowing is going to talk about, as far as I understand, say if you're a masculine person or a feminine person, you have the opposite, the polar opposite, sort of in your psyche. It's down in there, and a lot of people struggle with what that is and how do you relate to the opposite other gender or expectations of your own gender. And it's these deep things that are buried in our psyche. We can, once you've worked through kind of the shadow self, you've seen some of your more negative aspects, you can go deeper and you can work on these polarities within your psyche. And that can be done on theater as well, through a deep enough catharsis and a deep enough relation to the other characters on stage. You can see characters who have different genders from you and different relationships, and you can see yourself in them and get to see that position and help relate yourself to it. Past that, we're going to get to the whitening. I think the whitening is sort of just understanding these things. It's taking them into yourself and taking them into your own psyche, because that's kind of in the cathartic moment. That's going to be the breaking up of these these sort of chunks that are floating around in your subconscious. You're working your way through those. And the reddening is it's the final step in the alchemy. It's once you've worked your way through the problems, you've seen your polarities, you've seen your binaries, you've worked your way through kind of the chunks in your psyche, you can go into the reddening, and that's expressing the things you've learned and becoming a more, and I guess Jung would put it like an individual, more of a complete person of both your cognitive self and your buried self, your subconscious self can come together. And I see theater as a machine to help do this, to help you through this process. Now, it's not that you can go and see a play and like come out once and be all of a sudden like through this process, but it's just something to help you through this process of alchemy.
Well, and I feel like we see that, from time to time, even just with our Judas and Magnolia fans.
We do.
I mean, people will come up to us after shows and talk about some really intense things depending on the show. I mean, we've had people come up and say, how much our Firebox show meant to them because we never say these words, right? But the foundation of that show is really a message of suicide prevention, right? We never say those words, right? But the people who get it and who need it get it, And I've had parents come up to me and say, we come see you every year. Your show means so much to us because we lost our son, to suicide, this number of years ago. And, stuff like that. People talk to us about, their struggle with addiction. People talk to us about, their struggles with, their partner's infidelity. And because what our shows are, what our hope is through our shows is that we are inspiring people to continue on, even against what is seemingly insurmountable odds. It's that you keep going and you survive, right, and perhaps come out a little better.
Yeah, but you can't just tell somebody. We can hear it all the time. We hear PSAs and public service announcements. It's like, don't give up. But I believe, and we're going to kind of go back to the Greek here and talk about gnosis. Like, you can't just say it. A person has to feel it and experience it. And we think that from the stage. Is on the stage, we often say memento mori, memento vivere. You're going to die, so live your best life. But saying it's one thing. People can hear, oh, live your best life, or that you're going to die. But we want them to feel it. So when I'm about to go underwater, we want them to feel the dread of death. When I'm locked underwater, we want them to feel the anxiety of, will I get out? We want them to feel memento mori. That's important. Because that way, when I get out, they can feel memento vivere. They can feel a breath, he's alive, he's out. They can feel it. They can have the gnosis of what it is to go through that experience. And they can relate to me on stage and hopefully bring it into their own life.
It's weird to think about how your audience might personify their own challenges that they've experienced. You had mentioned like suicide, especially, like that's something that you internalize so deeply. And you said you never explicitly say it with your show, but for those who get it, they absolutely get it. And having that as an outlet and being able to experience it, and as you said before, having that cathartic moment of where it just clicks. And especially with the work that you do, having you come out on the other side and things are okay, and it has to be so rewarding as an audience member and as a performer.
Our shows are set up in an interesting way of just coming out of the other side. That's the important part, because I'm not the hero in the show. Like, there's some pirates and stuff that kidnap me and put me in a box. The pirates are never fought. The pirates are never defeated. I don't have to. That's not my job. My job is just to survive to the next moment.
Yeah, and you also, like, in these stories, like, he also doesn't save anyone else. Like, there's an entire crew of people who are murdered and don't survive, right? But the focus of the story is on his individual struggle and him making it out alive. And it's not a hero story. It's just a survival story, because sometimes that's where people are, and that's the story they need.
Yeah, it's not just sometimes, it's like that's where we all are. Always. We're always in the moment that we're trying to get through.
And I think it's much more relatable that way. I can't think of anyone in my life who I instantly think of and I'm like, oh yeah, they are on the hero's journey. Because that's not the world that we live in.
That's a strong one. Yeah.
Yeah.
A moving moment for what we do took place in Ohio a few years ago. I forgot what show we were doing. There was a young lady, young femme person in the front row. They were with an older person next to them. And I remember we do like 4 shows a day. And I remember they were in that front row, that same seat. They kept like coming back. And I don't know if it was months later. I don't know if it was a year later. But I remember they wrote us and let us know that they were a victim of human trafficking. And that they saw our show and they watched it and they watched it. And they thought at the end that they could also get out. And they got out. Theater has the ability to change lives. And if for no other reason than that, it's a sacred space. But it can get us to touch the divine, I believe, in kind of this way that I keep talking about with a cathartic moment on the extremes of human experience.
Yeah, it can. Yeah, I think it requires honesty, right? Like you guys are very honest. It sounds like in your performances. I think we can also lie, right? We can also prostitute ourselves in some ways in the theater. Um, we can think about art forms that don't move people quite so much as distract them. And then we can think about storytelling that does move people. Grotowski, right? Jerzy Grotowski talked about the difference between art that prostitutes and art that moves. And that the simpler it is, right? The purer it is. The more deeply the connection is felt with the artist, the character, the audience, the more we get to these kinds of experiences, like with your trafficked person who got out.
I just realized that Magnolia and I, at the beginning of this, we sort of took off running, but we didn't really say who we were. Like, we're escape artists and illusionists.
Surprise!
I guess we should actually tell the audience who we are. We're professional entertainers. We've done performance full time for over a decade. We perform across America and around the world. We're on stages at circuses, fairs, festivals, sometimes theater spaces.
Busking, street performance.
Well-traveled and well-skilled.
No, we like to try to be, at least.
Always an uphill battle, right?
We're trying. We're making the effort.
Well, I mean, the consequences of your work can be quite steep. So you definitely have a merit of skill, even if you're being
We rehearse quite a bit, and I think Luke is in reference to what we've referenced a few times. Some of our more dangerous stunts, like get wrapped in chains and locked underwater, or locked in a box and set on fire, or chained up into a human bear trap, that kind of stuff. Aside from that, we do a whole other slew of shows. We do mind-reading shows and seances, and our seances I'm particularly proud of. They're theatrical seances, so we reenact a seance, use it through illusion, and we tell our audiences this. We're not here to mislead anybody, but we are here to give people an experience. And it's amazing the experience that people have, even though we've gone into it saying, letting them know that it's theater. I've had people have religious experiences at our seances. A number of times I've had people stand up in the middle of our audience and say, "Amen," or "Praise the Lord."
Hallelujah.
Spontaneously. I have old ladies grab me after our seances and say, "You're a gift from God." But we've told them it's theater, but it's moving theater, and it really, in the end, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if I've told them it's not real. If their experience of the thing is real and they got to experience the divine, they got to experience the divine. Like, if they got to experience, they got to have a sacred moment. It doesn't matter if I was putting on a play or not. It matters to me that I told them, but as far as their point of view, if they experience the sacred in that moment of connection, well, then they experience the sacred. My putting on a play doesn't make it any different.
Yeah, I mean, when we think about tribal shamans, right, who blended ritual and theater, blended performance and healing, all these sorts of things. Very theatrical experience for a shaman to heal somebody. Often the entire village, would gather for these kinds of events if we're thinking, ancient tribal customs. And yet this is very much a psychosocial event, like you're saying. Whether the spirits arrive or not hardly matters. What matters is that the person is healed, and they're healed because they believe. And that belief is facilitated by the performer.
Yes. Yeah, I think that brings us back to Dionysus, with the chanting and the masks and the dancing that took place during a lot of those theatrical performances. It was very shamanistic. It was very raptured into the same feeling of community.
And Dionysus introduces this almost like an organized chaos in that regard, where you're, as you say, you could have people rended apart But on the flip side,
Well,
Dionysus, people, especially how is often remembered now being this god of wine and joviality and just joyous kind of celebration, and
Mhm.
it's so far removed from Dionysus's
right,
origin.
there is a vicious nature to him, and I think what we get in the theater and what Aristotle touched on in order for that cathartic moment to really take place was the safety.
Mm.
As we get to experience it, that viciousness, that craze, the revelry in whatever form it takes, the madness of theater, but in a safe space.
Mhm.
It's almost a warning against repression. I mean, Dionysus only really visits you in his vicious aspect if you refuse to believe in him as a
Hmm.
god. If you honor Dionysus as a god, then generally things are going to go okay for you. But if not, you will be Pentheus. He will tear you apart. Or rather, he'll get somebody else to do it for him.
Well, theater's similar in a way. If you're not going to like with the intent of enjoying the show, engaging with the show, it's not for you. You won't necessarily be torn apart, but you get nothing from it if you're not willing to put yourself into it and truly experience the experience as a whole. Then
It's
why are
natural
you
to be
there?
critical, Luke. Like it's
Yes.
natural to go into a show and be critical. But yes, if you are not willing to go along with, what Judas and Magnolia are doing, if you're not up for the escape artist routine, if you're not up for the
Yeah.
séance, then you shouldn't come into the theater because you're going to have a
Yeah.
terrible time and you're not going to get what everybody else is
You know,
getting.
it's interesting you bring that up because perhaps we perform a certain type of theater. We do street performance and we do like outside festivals where it can be rugged in an interesting way. For example, the first things I normally say when I step onto a stage is I sort of chum out and I go, oh, ladies and gentlemen, and then the crowd will cheer, and I'll say that was lame, and I'll hit them. I'll hit them with a savageness that then they buy into. They want that. There's something they want to feel unsafe, but in a safe space. If somebody's not cheering, I will just point at them in the audience.
Call them out.
And call them out until that's broken, until they have to smile. They
sad.
have to do something.
Yeah.
They're put into such a pressure that facade has to break, and they have to be in the moment. Because oftentimes I think when the person's not experiencing the theater, it's because they're not in the moment. They're looking for something in the future. They're removed from it in some way. There's a facade put up. They're on their cell phone maybe, but it can just be broken. They can be pulled into the moment of the madness.
Yeah.
They can be there. So I feel like in the street theater, the type of theater we do, we get to do that in a way that like maybe your classic theater doesn't. Your classic theater of Shakespeare can't be like, hey, you, uncross your arms.
Sucker.
Or like, you, put your phone down. Like they can't do that where we can. Like I can be.
And also, I will just put an asterisk on this and say that I am usually the one to open the show before we get to that part. I do actually say to our audience, I say, remember, folks, in order to have fun, you've got to be fun. And so it kind of, and what I like to think is kind of a gentle, playful, silly way, just reminds them like, hey, remember, like you're gonna get out of this whatever you put in, right? And it's really interesting to watch how the dynamic shifts, right? Whether it's their body language, their facial expressions, the way that they are interacting with the other people in their group sitting next to them. I can see the switch kind of flip for them once I say that, right? And then I step away and then I come back and then we really get the show started and now, they're invested. And for those who are still maybe not quite so sure, then the Hubs gets them. He comes at him next. And it is a really fascinating thing to watch their buy-in and their participation, because what we do is so participatory. It is so interactive. And it's really interesting to see how like our longtime fans who keep coming back really take on that message of memento mori, memento vivere, like just this past weekend after one of our shows, we had fans come up to us and tell us about how they're moving to New Zealand. And they were like, just like you say all the time, right? Memento mori, memento vivere. We're doing it. We're going to New Zealand. I was like, great. I love that for you. You know, but you know, it's about, you know, creating that safe space first, you know, and setting the ground rules and the expectations, and then holding them accountable is what the Hubs does.
Yeah. You create the safe space, and then it gives you the ability to challenge them.
Right, because they know.
And it gives Judas the chance to be the heel if he
Yeah,
needs to
because
be.
they're not really in danger, and they know that. And they know we might poke at them, like, but they can feel that it's not a real danger.
Yeah.
You know, it's an invitation to put away the facade and to be in the moment. Like, Bataille, I'm sure, talks about, like, you experience the sacred in the moment. It's not the anticipation of we can't look forward to get the sacred. We have to experience it in the moment. So unless you can break that facade and pull them in with you, they have no hope of having the catharsis in order to get to the sacred.
So hearing you say just now, like, it's not real danger, it's safe danger, makes me think about Chris, when Chris talks about safe horror. So one of our dear friends, Chris Buhlman, is a horror author. And some people on the podcast might know, I think his biggest work right now is The Black Tongue Thief. If you're not familiar, check it out. But I was never a horror fan before hanging out with Chris and hearing his thoughts about horror. And he writes, his horror is like werewolves and vampires and, you know, like monsters. And I remember the day he explained to me, because I don't know, I didn't expect his horror to have like what I think of as fantasy elements, you know, like werewolves and vampires and blah, blah, blah. And he was like, oh yeah, like I can't write just like humans doing terrible things. Like, that's too real. And he goes, I like safe horror. I want to be scared shitless, but at the end of the novel or the movie or whatever, I don't want to be like, oh, but is there a serial killer outside my window, like right now? You know, like, you know, if it's a werewolf novel, you don't have to be like, but is there a werewolf? No, like, it's not. It's safe, right? And that's so like, that was really fascinating to me, and I feel like that's what really we're creating, is like safe horror. Because when you go to the underwater escape artist stunt, and you know the guy performs that show 4 times a day, and before the show I'm like, will he escape? Will he survive?
But he's done it.
No one knows. It's live theater. Anything could happen. But like, no, you know it's fine. He does it 4 times.
Because he's done it like 9,000 times before.
Right.
So he's probably going to get out of that box.
It's fine. And yet, at the end of the show, people are crying. Like, literally, there are people in tears, and people are like, oh my God, you made it. And we're like, you're welcome. You wanted that. That's what you came here for. Go live your best life.
That's what the joy is your logical brain that's like, oh yeah, well, of course he's going to be fine. It sits as far back as possible, and you're just sitting, you know, on the edge of your seat, and you're anticipating, like, I don't know what's going to happen, even though everything, you know, logically says, oh yeah, he's going to be fine. He's practiced this. He is a professional. He's done this multiple times just today alone. But you throw that all away because you're so invested in what is happening.
Yeah, I really like that idea. Like, the logical brain takes a back seat in the theater, only because I want to take it back to Dionysus. Like, if this is his temple, like, and this is his temple, I want that logic. I want that reason to be in a back seat whenever we're in the fellow's place. I forgot, have you guys done an episode over Hildegard?
We have
not.
I think so, no.
Nope. We haven't done the medieval world very much, and I would like to focus on more medieval characters.
You know, Magnolia has a whole album of Hildegard's music she's produced. There's nobody on earth that I can think of that knows more about Hildegard von Bingen than Magnolia.
I don't know.
She bakes Hildegard's cookies, Hildegard's recipes.
I was literally just eating Hildegard's joy cookies before we started this podcast. And when I say that, sorry, I should clarify. It's the recipe is from the 12th century.
They weren't actually her
The
cookies.
cookies were not baked in the 12th century.
Yeah.
I baked those 2 days ago. But the recipe is based on Hildegard, a prescription. This was part of her medicine. She would prescribe up to 3 joy cookies per day for almost any ailment, y'all. They have cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg, which we know to all have medicinal properties, and everyone who tries them say that they work. So, what were you going to say?
No, I was going to mention what they have in them. That they are
cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg,
medicinal.
baby. Yeah, if you need my
That's what I needed as my flu
recipe.
cure.
Yeah.
The Mucinex wasn't cutting it.
Yeah,
Get some Hildegard cookies.
I got you. Yeah, or you can find my favorite Hildegard recipe on our Patreon, Judas and Magnolia, just saying.
I just want to say, I'm pretty proud that we were able to connect Aleister Crowley and Hildegard von Bingen
In the same episode.
and John
You're
Wesley
welcome.
in like a train of thought there. So I'm really happy about that personally.
Yeah. That's one of your biggest achievements to date, baby. Go team.
So where can we find Judas and Magnolia if we would like to? On the wide world of the web or in the
Well,
world?
the wide world of the web, the www, you can find us at Judas, not Julius, Judas,
Like the apostle.
and Magnolia.com.
Like the tree. Yes. And we're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, we're on Patreon. I think we're on Threads. That's a thing.
Yeah, that's. And how about some of your live dates, if you want to throw those out
That's
there?
a great question.
Yeah.
I will be updating our website with that tonight.
But for the listeners, we're
Perfect.
currently at the Sherwood Forest Fair, just outside of Austin, Texas, and we'll be at the Georgia Renaissance Festival, the Kentucky Renaissance Festival.
Ohio.
We'll be at the Ohio Renaissance Festival, Louisiana Renaissance Festival,
And around the world.
and around the world in between.
Watch our...
Very cool.
Excellent. Well, thank you both for joining us. It's just been a fantastic conversation and always a pleasure to speak with you.
Always fun.
Yeah.
Always
Thank
fun.
you.